Okay, so we're continuing along in Imrei Yaakov. We're up to Sif Vav in the Rav Shulchan Aruch, and we're talking about when you can assume that an object that is in the public domain is hefker, is considered to be ownerless because the owner has given up hope of ever retrieving the object. Um, and the last halacha that we were talking about is was not talking about the public domain at all, but we were talking about when you can assume that the finances of someone's home are within the purview of the other homeowners, of the other residents in that home, to be able to use those finances. So it's all in the general theme of yeush, of when does a person relinquish ownership of an object such that another person can take ownership of it instead. And that's really the basis, or sort of the core of all of these halachas, even though some of them have to do with finding lost objects, but it extends far beyond that, as you saw from our last discussion about when someone can give tzedakah from, their spouse's assets. So here we're going to see another halacha. This goes into not lost objects, but when you can pick up something that's in the public domain where you know where it came from, the question is, does the owner relinquish ownership of it or not? And this has to do with agriculture, but there may be other applications as well. Um, when someone puts something out on their front yard, they have an old piece of furniture or another used item, and they put it on their front yard, that has become the convention that they don't want it anymore. I know my newlywed kids, found two office chairs on their neighbor's front yard, and they said, "Is it okay for us to take it in?" I said, "Of course." That's the biggest sign that that person has relinquished ownership. They've basically made those objects hefker. And now the question is, when it comes to, let's say, a person has an orchard and fruit and produce falls out of the orchard, can people take it if it's on the street? Okay, so this is what this halach is about in Sifvav. Lefichach, hamotzei te'enim baderech tachat ilan hate'ena shehu noteh al haderech. So the halacha is as follows. Let's say you're walking down the street, and there's an overhanging tree, and this tree is a fruit tree. And in this illustration, it is a fig tree. And the figs, you know that the figs belong to the tree owner, but since some branches protrude out into the public domain, some of the figs fall to the ground on the sidewalk and in the Rishus Harabim. So are you allowed to take those figs? So he says, Mutter la'achlan, afal pisha ha'ba'olam enam yodim adayin min afilas te'enam elu. He says you're allowed to take the figs that have fallen into the public domain, even if the owner is not yet even aware that those figs have fallen. And the reason is, even though we normally say that yeyush shalom midas lo havi yeyush, that something that has fallen from someone's possession, that they normally would relinquish ownership, but if they haven't yet relinquished it, it's not yet relinquished. Lefi shekaven shedarkan shel te'enim lipol min ha'ilan, nisyashu ha'ba'olam min hanoflim b'derech, b'techilas gemar gidulan. He says the argument here is that since a tree owner knows that his fruit is going to fall off the tree, he already knows in advance, when the fruit has begun to ripen, that anything that falls off of this tree that falls into the public domain, he's relinquishing ownership of. He doesn't have any hope of retrieving it, and afilu imrov ha'ovrim shamheim Yisrael. And that's true not because the passers-by are assumed to be nefarious and they're just going to grab his stuff, but so it's not just when there's a majority of, let's say, non-law abiding non-Jews, even if the majority of the people are Jewish. He says the argument is mipnei shahateina nim'eses b'nefilasa ve'ena chashuva be'enei be'aleha litroach l'chapes achareha. He says the argument is that most fig tree owners have the attitude that when I want to harvest my figs, I'm not going to pick the figs up off the ground, because by and large, once they hit the sidewalk, they're going to get mushy and spoiled. And so it's automatic that any fig that falls into the public domain, we assume that the owner doesn't want, right? And so this makes a big difference depending upon the product that has fallen off the tree. In the case of the fig tree, the fig becomes spoiled almost immediately once it falls off the tree. And so therefore there's an assumption that the owner only wants the figs that are ripe, that are still attached to the tree, and is sort of going to forego all of the other figs. And that's why it depends. It'll be different when it comes to a different kind of tree. Aval bezesim v'charuvim v'chayotze bohen she'eni masim b'nefilasan. But if we're dealing with a different kind of produce, an olive tree, a carob tree, okay, that when those fruits fall, they don't spoil when they hit the ground. A fig is very soft and tender. It hits the ground, it's no longer really usable for its owner, by and large, okay? But with olives and carob, which have a hard sort of constitution, an olive can hit the ground if it's falling off the tree, and it's perfectly fine. And it's quite common for an owner to retrieve the olives that have fallen off the tree that are on the ground. And the same thing with carob. And therefore, Aser Imrov ha'ovrim sham Yisrael. So then you're not allowed to take the olives or the carobs that fall off the tree and are in the public domain if the majority of people are Jewish, because then we know that the owner has not relinquished ownership of these items, because he's still planning to come out on the sidewalk in front of his property and to retrieve whatever's fallen off the tree. So by implication, if the majority of the passers-by are non-Jewish, then the owner is also going to have yeush, because he knows that he can't stop the people who are not going to listen to him from picking up the stuff. But in a situation, even when if the situation is the majority of people are law-abiding or they're Jewish, and they want to respect this person's property, so then you're not allowed to take them, because you have to suspect that the owner may want them and was going to want to pick them up. And then he says, "Utamarim dinam kiteinim," that dates and figs are of the same category, because dates also, fresh dates, are very tender. And also, shahaba olam yisyashim bahem afilu barov Yisrael mipnei shabehemos v'achayos ochlim osam machmas mitikutam. He says the reason why dates, even though they may be a little bit tougher than figs, is because once they hit the ground, the owner assumes that the bugs and the birds and the critters will be all over them, okay, because they're very sweet. Dates are very sweet, and they give off a fragrance, and it attracts creatures right away. And as soon as they hit the ground, the owner assumes that they're going to be scavenged by the wildlife. Bameh dvarim amurim bistam. Okay, and so all of this is when you're dealing with a tree that is protruding out into the public area, and there are no signs and there are no indications one way or the other. So fig trees and date trees you can take, because you can assume that the owner has given up. Olive trees and carob trees you have to leave where it is, because the owner may want to reclaim them. Okay, but bameh dvarim amurim bistam. But that's all when there's no other indicators. Aval im gila balabayis daito she'eno misyayish mehem. But let's say the owner has done something, or has put up a sign, or done other things to show that he wishes to retrieve the figs and the dates that fell on the sidewalk. Kigon shetikein makom sheyiplu bo hatimarim hanoflim beruach. So let's say, for example, he laid down some kind of tarp or some kind of other kind of collector on the ground, which indicates that he wants the dates to be, instead of hitting the sidewalk, he wants them to hit a softer surface. Ve'ein sarach lomar im hekif is hadikolim begeder, or let's say he put a fence around his trees, which indicates that he wants to retrieve the fruit that falls to the ground. Because if you weren't concerned about retrieving the fruit that falls to the ground, why would you put a fence around specifically the trees? Shelo yava'u shama behemos v'chayos, which is an indication that he wants to fend off the critters who want to come, the wildlife who would want to come and eat the fruit that hits the ground. So harei gam hanoflim chutz lageder asurin. So therefore, even the produce that falls outside the fence is forbidden. Hol va'achshav adayin eno yodeya shenaflu elu hatmarim chutz lageder afal pi shechesheyivada lo yisyayish mehem. So he says like this. He says the fruit even that falls outside the fence is going to be usser, because it could be that he would have yeyush for the fruit that falls outside the fence. But since now he doesn't know about it, and he's done something to indicate that he does plan to retrieve all the fruit that falls off the tree and hits the ground, you have to give him that opportunity to retrieve those things, and only after you know that he for sure has given up on the stuff that is on the ground are you allowed to take it. But if you have no indicator, then you're not allowed to. Let's say the guy puts up a sign, says don't eat the fruit, right? Or no trespassing, or whatever it is. So then you have to respect that.
Rabbi, does it matter if the owner of the trees is not Jewish? Does it make a difference, Jewish or not Jewish?
I don't believe it makes a difference, because this is not an issue of a mitzvah, of a lost object. This is an issue of gezel. If something belongs to someone and they haven't relinquished ownership, you're not allowed. Then taking it is tantamount to theft, right? And we know that the laws of theft apply equally to Jews and non-Jews. You cannot steal from a non-Jew, right? So it shouldn't make a difference whether the owner is a Jew or a non-Jew. If you know that if you're not sure, if you have no indication that he's relinquished ownership of the produce, you have to leave it where it is. Okay? All right. So let's go on to the next halacha. V'chein im habe'alim heim yitomim. He says another illustration will be if the owner is a he calls them an orphan, but really it's any child. The reason why the illustration of an orphan was chosen is because usually children are not going to be orchard owners, tree owners. If it's a minor, so it's usually because he's an orphan that he becomes the owner of these trees. Asurim hatamarim afilu bistam shahaketanim eini usham u'mechilasum klum afal pisha bevada yisyashu v'yimchelu gam kesheyigdelu. Then there's another consideration. Even if an adult would relinquish ownership, a child does not have the ability to relinquish ownership because they simply don't have the das, they don't have enough cognizance to relinquish ownership halachically, such that which they've already acquired now becomes ownerless. We've discussed this issue when we were learning Maseches Sukkah. If you remember, those of you who were learning Maseches Sukkah with us, we talked about if a man acquires a set of arba minim, a lulav and an esrog, the Torah says on the first day of Sukkot, ulakachtem lachem bayom harishon, that the lulav and esrog has to belong to you. It cannot be borrowed from somebody else. So the Gemara had said, make sure that when you that if you have a minor child and that child wants to use your lulav and esrog, make sure that you make the bracha and fulfill your mitzvah before you let your child use it. The reason is because when you give it to your child, a child has the ability to acquire an object when someone else has given it to him. But he does not have the mental ability to relinquish ownership and give it back to its owner. And as a result, if you haven't yet fulfilled your mitzvah of lulav and esrog on the first day, and you give it to your child to use it first, you've given it to him to acquire, it's his, and he doesn't have the ability to give it back to you, halachically, to relinquish ownership. Because you need a certain mental focus that a child yet doesn't have the ability according to halacha. And so applying this to our halacha over here is that if the owner of the tree is a minor, so then even when it comes to figs and dates, where normally there's a complete relinquishment of ownership for anything that falls to the ground, okay, a child doesn't have that ability. Umikol makom, and then he says in parentheses, Im nasan hakatan matana miritzono, matanaso matana mitakones chachamim, kidei sheyisu v'yitnu imo habrios. If a child gives a gift to someone, then halachically that gift is a gift. Even though we just got through saying that a minor does not have the ability to relinquish ownership, this is a rabbinic decree that the rabbis made, that they said that if a child gives a gift, we will, even though normally there's no ability for a child to relinquish ownership and transfer ownership, but nonetheless, when it comes to express gifts, you are allowed to accept those gifts from a child. It's a takonas chachamim, and the rabbis do have the ability to create a transfer of ownership, even when normally the mechanism doesn't work. It's a principle called hefker based in hefker, that the Beis Din can declare something ownerless even when it has not been relinquished by its owner. And it's basically sort of like a superpower that the Beis Din has over the Jewish community, is that when they see that a necessity for it, they can create an item. They can declare an item now to be ownerless, even when it is owned by someone, and they do that in very special circumstances, and this is one of those special circumstances, that if a child gives a gift, they make the relinquishment binding not because of the child's abilities, but rather because the Beis Din sort of supervises those gifts and declares the gift, the relinquishment, to be binding. And they did that. Why? Kidei sheyisu v'yitnu imo habrios, because they want, especially when it comes to orphans who are an underprivileged class, if we would make their exchanges, if we would make their gifts not legally allowable, then no one would want to have anything to do with them. They would become like a pariah within an economic society which is sometimes heartless and cruel, and therefore, in order to give them more economic opportunity, the rabbi said that whatever they relinquish and whatever they exchange or barter and so forth is legally binding. So when it comes to their orchard and their produce, the rabbi, since we're not dealing with an express relinquishment of property, but it's an assumption of relinquishment, there, if you know that the trees are owned by a minor, you can't go ahead and take the fruit, even though if their counterpart adult would have for sure relinquished it. But for all other halachos of where there's an express relinquishment of property by the minor, there the chachamim step in using the principle of hefker based in hefker, and they say that the child's exchange and the child's relinquishment is a valid act nonetheless. Okay, any questions on that idea? Okay. Um, in the Likutim, he has an interesting question. A Kohen has the ability, there's a special law of Vikidashto, that you have to give special sanctity to a Kohen. And so therefore, normally you're not allowed to utilize the services of a Kohen uh, because you're violating his sanctity or the obligation to give him special honor. So, for example, the Talmud says you're supposed to let the Kohen always get the first aliyah. If a group of people are walking through a door and one of them is a Kohen, you're supposed to let the Kohen walk through first. If you need a favor for someone to pass something to me, you're not supposed to ask a Kohen. You're supposed to ask somebody else because the Kohen is supposed to have special sanctified status within society. But of course, why is it that we, guys like Izzy and me do favors for people all the time? And we open the door for other people because our mothers taught us to do that. Even though Izzy and I are Kohanim, we do favors and we do things for people. Why is that? Because the halacha is that a Kohen can be mochel on his kavod. A Kohen can be foregoing and forgiving on his honor, and basically say, yes, I know, you're supposed to do everything for me and give me honors. Like, for example, if you are dining with a group of people and there's a Kohen at the table, so normally the Kohen is supposed to lead the benching, right? He's supposed to lead the zimun. But is a Kohen allowed to say, come on, guys, I've been doing it for the last 5 times. Let somebody else do it, right? So they're going to say, how can you say that? You're a Kohen, v'kidashto. We have an obligation to honor you. He says, guys, it's enough. Let somebody else do it. A Kohen has a right to do that, right? A Kohen can be mochel on his kavod. The question is, does a minor Kohen have the ability to be foregoing on his honor? And so that's an interesting shaila. Just like a Kohen, a minor does not have das, does not have sufficient cognition to be able to relinquish ownership. There are some poskim who argue that a minor Kohen does not have sufficient cognition to be able to be mochel, to be able to be forgiving on their honor that they were born with as a Kohen. So it may be problematic to have a little Kohen, little boy, open the door for you. But I think that in the final analysis, the majority of the poskim would say it's okay, simply because it's all part of the mitzvah of chinuch, of educating a child. That little 8-year-old little Kohen, respect your elders, and you better open up the door for if 2 people are coming through the door, just because you're a Kohen doesn't mean you get to go in before the rabbi or whatever it is, So therefore, most poskim are saying that yes, even though normally a katan, a minor, does not have sufficient cognition to know how to be foregoing on their honor, but for educational purposes, you can discipline a little Kohen little boy and tell him, just because you're a Kohen doesn't mean you don't have to do your homework, and it doesn't mean that you don't have to do nice things for your elders and respect your elders. Okay, so that's what he brings down in the Likutim. We're not gonna. That's all. I've just paraphrased it from his text over there. Okay. In Sif Ches, we get back to the halachos of finding lost objects, and so I think that what we'll do is we'll save that for tomorrow, and we'll start the new Sif tomorrow. Any other questions, comments before we break for today? Quiet group.
So this question about the little Kohen.
Yeah.
Does he have enough cognition to know that he's supposed to get this honor?
Well, he may have learned in Cheder that there's a mitzvah v'kidashto, you shall sanctify the Kohen. His Rebbe told him. that the Kohen always gets the first licks. If there's a group of boys sitting down at the table and they're sharing something that's being served to them in the cafeteria, the Kohen gets to cut in front of the line. I mean, that's what they learn, that's what. So the little Kohen boy, uh, with his chest, out, says, "Hey, I'm a Kohen. I get to cut in line. Uh, I get to take the first portion." I mean, that's really what the Gemara says. So we can, for educational purposes, we can say to this Kohen, "I think you should be mochel on your honor." He says, "I don't want to be mochel on my honor." Well, he's going to become a spoiled brat, this Kohen, right? So we have to know that for education, we have to be able to put the little Kohen in his place, so that he's going to grow up to be a nice boy and become a mature, responsible adult. And so that's the reason why, we have to be able to put the little Kohen in his place. I know for sure my parents put me in my place plenty of times, and I'm appreciative that they did. And I've done the same thing to my little Kohens as they were growing up, and I'm glad that I did. And I'm sure you too, Izzy.
So I'm wondering, Rabbi, about the responsibility on the rest of us Israelis who, like, I appreciate the Kohanim can give up their honor, but to what extent do we have to extend it and remind them that they should have it unless they say, I'm okay?
Well, like I said, this normally comes up in social situations. So in all social situations, for example, in a synagogue, the Kohen always gets the first aliyah. That's instituted. That's actually that's codified in law. What's not as clear is you're at a Shabbos table with a bunch of guests. They put down a plate in the middle of the table, and they ask every one of the guests to please help yourselves. Okay? So really, if you know that one of the guests at the table is a Kohen, you're supposed to offer the Kohen the first cookie, or whatever they're serving. Okay? And if you are aware of it, then it's considered to be the fulfillment of a mitzvah to offer the Kohen the first cookie.
Because, Rabbi, I think that's less often done than asking the Kohen to bench. That
Correct.
you know about, but
Right.
the other part that's sort of the more physical benefits don't usually get extended to the Kohen in my experience.
Yeah, well, I'm telling you, next time I want that cookie, Paul. So you better think about it next
I'd
time.
extend it to you as the Rav, though. But yes, as the Kohen as well.
Yeah.
Izzy is a better example because I'll have to keep him in mind.
Yeah, yeah. Well,
Okay.
I mean, look, I mean, it's not something that we actively think about, because when you look at Izzy, your first initial thought about Izzy Kutnowski is not that he's a Kohen, he's your buddy, right?
Yeah.
So that's the reason why, because we don't live in that kind of formalized society the way that we used to. But if it does come to mind, it's a good thing to do. It means that you're thinking about what the halacha would say to do in every kind of social situation. Okay.
Rabbi?
Yeah.
Yeah, I don't know if it's a good example, but let's say birthday gifts that are given to minor children that
Yeah.
the parents use for, let's say they buy them something, but the kid himself didn't really want that, but the parents were going to buy it anyways. Is that taking money from the child? And the child really hasn't given them, are not yeush on that money.
You mean you're taking it from the child's bank account?
Well, let's say a grandparent gives, to somebody for the child's birthday, and it's the child's money because the grandparents give it for the grandchild, but the parents use it to buy the child something that they would have needed to buy for them anyways.
Well, if the parent needed to buy it for the child as part of their halachic obligation to raise their child, they're not supposed to use the child's money for that. So up to a certain age, there's an obligation for a parent to clothe and feed a child. So you can't use their money to buy clothing for them. But let's say the child wants a pair of Nikes, right? Which is not a parent's halachic obligation to buy $100 pair of Nikes for their child. So then you can say to the child, well, I don't want to get you that expensive pair, but if you want to use the money that grandma and grandpa gave you, then by all means we'll go ahead and use that money for your Nikes. But that the child does have the ability to say, yes, please get me that. But to use that child's money to purchase something that you think the child would want, uh, uh, that you would not have the right to do, because it's not your money to use. It's the child's money. I mean, we can talk about this more tomorrow, but that's the basic halacha. Okay?